This brief lecture will cover Chapter 2 in the Karen Seccombe book, So You Think I Drive a Cadillac. And it addresses, she steps back from the personal narratives that she uses as sort of the main focus of this textbook, and talks a little bit about some of the historical context in which the modern social welfare system exists today. When you compare this to Phyllis Day's chapter on the Depression and New Deal, of course, for instance, this is a leap forward by several decades, and as the course goes along, we'll be talking about this chapter in more detail as Phyllis Day presents it in her textbook. But just by way of introduction, I think it's useful to tie this into where you're at in your current studies in the social welfare system, so that you can kind of see where all of this is leading today, to the program today. And one of the things that she does is looks at the history of cash assistance over the 20th century and into the 21st century. As we have talked about before, you know, the whole notion of cash assistance, direct relief, or outdoor relief, as we have talked about in previous weeks, has really been very controversial. A lot of people believe that handing out, and still believe this today, that kind of handing out direct assistance, cash, or direct benefits to individuals discourages the work ethic, and that people will take advantage of that system. And so it was really 100 years ago or so before we began to see the government at least being involved in direct assistance. And this will tell you a little bit about some of that, how some of that works. For instance, in the progressive era, we talked about the mother's pension and how widows and with children were given the means to support themselves. This was necessary in those days because, for the most part, women were not in the workforce, and so it was considered to be useful for the government to provide assistance to those mothers. There still was some stigma associated with this, although perhaps not as much as today. Just simply because these were largely single women who were not married, and there were a number of different things that caused individuals to look down on people who were receiving this pension. When the New Deal was implemented after the Great Depression during Franklin Roosevelt's term, of course, the Social Security Act was implemented, and a part of that Social Security Act was the Aid to Dependent Children provision, which provided assistance to mothers, single mothers with young children in the home. Now, again, in the context of the times, because of the Depression, there was a motivation to keep mothers out of the workforce, because the jobs needed to be set aside and made available to the adult male workers who were considered to be the heads of households in those days in particular. And so this program was intended to make it easier for mothers to not be in the workforce, and was seen to be an extra benefit because the mothers would be at home with their children instead of working. Again, it wasn't long before a stigma associated with this program began to develop and has grown considerably to the modern day. While the caretaker was added to the grant in the 1950s, the grant was changed to Aid to Families with Dependent Children, or AFDC, in the John Kennedy administration. Richard Nixon proposed a plan called the Family Assistance Plan, which was to guarantee a certain minimum income to individuals who, to all households or families or whatever in particular, but the minimum income that was proposed was just terribly deficient, and it wouldn't have been sufficient for an individual or a family to support themselves. This program never really passed through Congress. I think the House passed the bill, but the Senate defeated it, and it never was implemented. Interestingly, though, the Supplemental Security Income, SSI, was federalized during the Nixon years, and really, in a sense, became a sort of a guaranteed minimum income for individuals who didn't have a work history. Under Ronald Reagan, there were efforts made to get the federal government out of social welfare programs, and so instead of designing programs and handing them over to states to administer federal funds, what Reagan did was essentially set up, or his administration set up, a system whereby states were given block grants for social services, and it was up to the states to determine what was done with those block grants. as you'll learn, as far as social services is concerned. Now, as you'll learn later in the semester, there were a number of different things that really limited the amount of money that actually got to clients during the Reagan administration. For one thing, it was possible for for-profit agencies to apply to be able to provide social services for needy individuals. So you see there was a portion of that federal block money that actually could go to the for a profit-making venture, as opposed to a nonprofit agency administering the funds. More about that later, but the Reagan years were really pretty lean years as far as social services goes, and a number of programs that were considered pretty basic, such as women's, infants, and children, and those kinds of programs saw some cutbacks during the Reagan years. George H.W. Bush, that's our most recent George Bush's father, really continued to carry out Reagan's programs during his 4 years in office, placed a lot of emphasis on volunteerism and private charity. In his nomination speech in 1988 at the Republican National Convention, he talked about 1,000 points of light, and that was the effort to stir up people to become volunteers and to take care of the needy voluntarily rather than the government having to be responsible for them. Bill Clinton, who defeated George Bush when he ran for a second term, first of all, attempted in the first years of his administration to implement universal health care, and was really shot down pretty summarily by Congress. During a period of time when there was a real rising tide of conservatism in Congress and elsewhere around the nation, led by Newt Gingrich as Speaker of the House, and his contract with America, which was intended to cut back on welfare recipients and to decrease cash assistance payments. In any event, Clinton, who started out kind of much to the left of the political center, had to move towards the center in order to stay in office as well as to get things achieved in Congress. And so in 1996, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act was passed by Congress. Clinton had promised during his campaign to end welfare as we knew it, and this was his administration's answer to welfare program. The AFDC program, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children, was eliminated, and a new program called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, referred to as TANF nationally, was implemented. And again, each state was given the opportunity to shape its own program, and depending upon the kinds of requirements and everything, would get more or less money from the federal government. In Alaska, the TANF program is called ATAP, or Alaska Temporary Assistance Program, and you'll notice the emphasis in both titles upon temporary. The idea is that this was only a passing need, and so individuals were given up to 2 years, and at the end of those 2 years they were expected to be working. Some daycare services were provided through this program, or some payment for daycare services at least was provided for, because it was recognized that daycare is essential if mothers are to be working. And a few other things were worked into that program. Again, we'll be talking more about this later in the semester. But the TANF program was intended to cut welfare rolls, and indeed it did. The question is whether or not the individuals who were cut from the rolls are living a better life or not. Because while they may be working, and I'm saying may be working, the question is whether or not the jobs that they were able to get would provide a living wage for those families. The goals of TANF, and this was mentioned in my previous presentation in Chapter 1. Seccombe mentioned this also, but you can see here the goals really focus on, for one thing, maintaining children in their own home. And it's interesting that is added as the first goal, because some of the Republicans, again Gingrich and others who were leading this very conservative revolution so to speak, in 1994 and 96, were really pushing for an end to cash assistance, and said that if Gingrich was quoted, I believe, as saying that if families couldn't afford to take care of the children should be removed and put in orphanages. And so that, again, we're kind of back to that mindset of the early 1800s, when institutional care was thought to be the answer for everything, and poverty was the fault of the individual. And so the TANF program at least put a focus on keeping children in their own homes. And then from there you see the themes of work, training, and marriage, which again reflected some of the very, very conservative thinking of the days. And I wouldn't say narrow-minded, but I would say that certainly focused upon a particular idea of what is the correct way to live, which is a two-parent family, marriage, and children within that context, taking care of those children yourself. Seccombe also spends the last part of the chapter talking about different explanations of poverty and the reasons why welfare is necessary, and this is worth talking about. Days addresses these themes more on kind of a general basis throughout her textbook, but in response to the question that you'll hear me say from time to time, why are people poor? Here's some of the answers for this, and in particular, perhaps the first two are the most important of those explanations. The first theory is the individualism theory, that we are responsible for our own economic position in society. So if we're poor, it's our own fault. This theory really does rely heavily upon the American value of individualism and democratic egalitarianism, and it rests upon the theory that everyone, if they try their best, can pull themselves up by their bootstraps and be successful in this society, that there's a job out there for everyone, and if they only look in the right place and are willing to do the right things to get it. Seccombe does talk about how, particularly for women, there's quite a handicap, and low-wage women, single mothers, quite a handicap in trying to access jobs, and she disputes the notion of individualism as an explanation for poverty. But nonetheless, as you know, that's a very popular theory in our culture and our society, that people are poor through their own fault and lack of effort. The second theory, social structuralism theory, suggests that poverty results from the social and economic imbalances in the social structure. This would be the explanation that really kind of rested behind the implementation of all the New Deal programs in the 1930s. The notion that government had to step in and reshape the work site, reshape social services in particular, reshape the economy in some respects, and provide direct assistance to families and individuals in order to correct the economic problems that were rampant in those days. This is the theory that suggests that there indeed is not equal access to the resources in our society, and the lack of equal access is the explanation for why people become poor. The social structural theory is one of those theories, by the way, that rests behind the affirmative action program. So just something for you to keep in mind as we go on in the semester in our work. A couple of other theories that are also kind of thrown out there from time to time, but perhaps aren't as primary as the first two, include the culture of poverty theory, that postulates that there is a subset of values and traits and expectations that people who live in poverty have that hand down to the next generation, and that really this expectation, the lowered expectations and lower wishes of things from life or whatever, result from the fact that people just live in poverty and don't know better. The other one, fatalism, is this idea that wealth or poverty is really created by quirks of nature. You know, where you're born, just bad luck, chance, getting sick and not being able to recover from that, having low intelligence, those types of things. And so you see there are a number of different kinds of theories that rest underneath the idea about why people are poor. when you read the rest of the chapter, or the rest of the Seccombe book and Phyllis Day's book, of course, you're going to see that these experts in this field really point towards the social structural reasons for poverty. There may be individual actions that occur that exacerbate, and from time to time there are some individuals certainly who, could do better, but as an answer to relieving poverty and as an explanation for why people have to be on welfare, the individualistic explanation just isn't sufficient overall. So that is a brief summary of Chapter 2 in the Seccombe book. As I promised you, this would be a much shorter lecture and summary, and I hope as you continue reading the Seccombe book, and we will be reading more of this now, a little bit more intensely during the rest of the semester, I hope that you'll kind of see how you can tie this back into the historical perspective that Phyllis Day is giving you and in her textbook, and kind of see how the two of them intertwine.